title of my talk, Practical Deleuzism, names really a project rather than a specific paper. So the specific paper that I'm going to give has to do with the internet, and so we might call it Deleuze and the internet. The aim of the overall project, which is really my project in general, is to try to figure out how to use Deleuze to actually do something, and how to turn it into a form of an analytic apparatus, and something to enable us to read text, to think about culture. I think for me, one of the problems that I have with some of the ways in which Deleuze studies has been done is that we tend to use Deleuzian concepts to name things or to describe things, but not necessarily to analyse them. And I'm speaking very generally, of course, so I'm also speaking about myself. So partly what I'm trying to say is I want to figure out how to go past that point of simply naming or describing things and moving to a position of analysing things. I want to start this paper with a brief quote that I found in the magazine The Economist by John Battelle, who wrote a book which I'll be talking about Google. Anyway, this is a quote from him. He says, "I found myself more and more wary of Google out of some primal lizard brain fear of giving too much control of my data to one source." End of quote. Now, there can be no doubt that the internet has transformed practically every aspect of contemporary life. I guess within critical theory, it has transformed especially how we think about the body and its relation to identity and to place. Once the twin cornerstones of social existence and, of course, social theory, in social life you are always someone from somewhere, the son or daughter of so-and-so from such and such a town. These details of our existence, which are essentially historical, although they may sometimes take the form biologists think belong to their domain, i.e. gender, race, body shape and so on, these details segment us in different ways, slicing and dicing us this way and that, so that we adhere to the conventions and demands of what Deleuze and Guattari call the socius. And I'll just give you a brief quote from A Thousand Plateaus. They say, "We are segmented in a binary fashion, following the great major dualist oppositions, social classes, but also men, women, adults, children, and so on. We are segmented in a circular fashion, in ever larger circles, ever wider discs or coronas, like Joyce's letter, my affairs, my neighbourhood's affairs, my cities, my countries, the world's. We are segmented in a linear fashion along a straight line or a number of straight lines, of which each segment represents an episode or a proceeding. As soon as we finish one proceeding, we begin another, forever proceduring or procedured in the family, in the school, in the army, or in work. These segmentations penetrate our being, they appear and even feel bodily, especially the apparently natural attributes of gender and race. But, for all that, they are not visceral." Deleuze and Guattari are very specific about this. They describe these socially orchestrated captures of the body, gender, race, class, work, family, and so on, as incorporeal transformations. If today, as Deleuze foresaw with typical acuity in his short paper on what he labelled the society of control, our credit card and our social security numbers are more significant identity and place markers than the colour of our skin or where we went to school, that isn't because the meat of our bodies, to use the William Gibson term, has lately been superseded in its cultural significance by our bloodless digital profile. Rather, what has happened is that one incorporeal apparatus of capture has been succeeded by another. The segmentations of race, of gender and class have been supplanted by the segmentations of debt and credit. And as Deleuze puts it, a man is no longer a man confined, but a man in debt. In effect, our body has been replaced as the principal site of power by our profile. Now, I'm just using the term profile as an alternate to the body, by which I simply mean any form of digital capture of our body, particularly through apparatuses like banking agencies and so on. But this does not mean that the age of the body has been succeeded by the age of the body without organs, as many of the internet inclined have argued, because the disciplined or segmented body was just as much a body without organs as is the ghostly profile government agencies and banks make of us and store in their databases for referral whenever we want a loan or a driver's license or to leave the country for a vacation or whatever. It will no doubt come as a surprise to many that the clearest confirmation of this point, that the disciplined body is already a body without organs, is in fact to be found in Foucault's book Discipline and Punish, which is often read as a history of the body. Although it shouldn't really be that much of a surprise if you read the dedication at the end. Foucault says quite clearly that in writing that book he was indebted to Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, and it was written some 6 years after Anti-Oedipus. Referring to Kantorowicz's influential thesis that the king effectively has two bodies, one that lives and dies and another that is immortal, hence the famous phrase, "The king is dead, long live the king," Foucault writes, "If the surplus power possessed by the king gives rise to the duplication of his body, has not the power exercised on the subjective body of the condemned man given rise to another type of duplication, that of a non-corporal, a soul, as may be called it? The history of this microphysics of the punitive power would then be a genealogy, or an element in the genealogy, of the modern soul. Rather than seeing this soul as the reactivated remnants of an ideology, one would see it as the present correlative of a certain technology of power of the body. It would be wrong to say that the soul is an illusion or an ideological effect. On the contrary, it exists, it has reality, it is produced permanently around, on, within the body by the functioning of power that is exercised on those punished, and in a more general way on those one supervises, trains, corrects, over madmen, children at home and at school, the colonised, over those who are stuck at a machine and supervised for the rest of their lives." End of quote. The soul, then, is the body without organs seen in its disciplined aspect, but it is not the whole of the body without organs. Foucault's vision of the duplication of the body is, I want to suggest, an impoverished one in comparison to Deleuze and Guattari's, and he pays the price of this conceptual diminishment by shearing himself of any plausible means of explaining how or why one might adhere to the conventions and demands of the socius, except through coercion. So the difference between Foucault and Deleuze then is that Foucault's theory or model relies on some kind of notion of coercion, whereas Deleuze and Guattari are trying to theorise something that revolves around a notion of the voluntary, that we voluntarily submit to power, whereas Foucault tends to think in terms of a coercion. The full body without organs is the soul animated by desire. And Foucault's description of the modern soul is instructive nonetheless because it points up the degree to which the body without organs is a social rather than an individual concept. We all have our body without organs, but it is plugged into a larger entity that is the body without organs of all body without organs, or what they sometimes also call the plane of consistency. This larger entity that all our individual bodies without organs is plugged into is society's own body without organs, and it is my contention that we can only properly understand this particular concept if we apprehend it at this level. So in other words, and putting it very briefly, what I'm trying to suggest is that body without organs has to be understood as social first. Only if we understand it as social first, then we can understand it on an individual level. As a first measure, then, in standing this concept back on its feet, it has to be recognised that although Artaud is the source of the phrase body without organs, his work plays only a very small part in its theorisation as a concept. This is not to say Artaud is unimportant to Deleuze and Guattari, but the truth is that they tend to treat his work as what they would later call pre-philosophical, as a source of symptoms or ideas rather than concepts. So the body without organs doesn't come out of Artaud as a concept, it comes out of his work as a pre-philosophical symptom, or something that they need to then work over in order to turn it into a concept. By focusing on Artaud, we reinforce the misperception that the body without organs is the exclusive preserve of individuals. Correcting this view requires that we look at the concept's more important conceptual sources, namely Lacan, Spinoza and Marx. Now this list is in either ascending or descending order depending on your point of view. Deleuze and Guattari attribute the invention of the concept to Lacan, but this seems to be of significance only in as much as that they can use it against the Lacanians. The famous phrase where Deleuze and Guattari said that they wrote Anti-Oedipus to save Lacan from the Lacanians. They suggest that the architecture of the concept was foreshadowed by Spinoza, and they take from this source the notions of longitude and latitude, which they use to map the body without organs components. They reserve for Marx, however, the special distinction of showing us how this concept works in everyday life at the level of the mode of production. In light of this, I want to argue for the priority of Marx in any reading of the body without organs on the ground that, to follow a Jamesonian logic, the Marxian position subsumes the other two. Now, on its first or Lacanian approximation, the body without organs is simply the constellation of partial objects constituting our desire in its transitive mode. It is described by Deleuze and Guattari as the real inorganisation of desire, such as one finds on the reverse side of what Zizek likes to call the big O. There, desire is shifted into the order of production, related to its molecular elements, where it lacks nothing because it is defined as the natural and sensuous objective being at the same time as the real is defined as the objective being of desire. Desire, on this understanding, constantly surpasses the neat triangle of mummy, daddy and me imposed on it by psychoanalysis. On its second or Spinozist approximation, the body without organs is the immanent substance, the most Spinozist sense of the word. The partial objects, i.e. Lacan's petit r, are like its ultimate attributes, which belong to it precisely insofar as they are really distinct and cannot on this account exclude or oppose one another. But the significance of this insight can really only be seen when it is rewritten into a Marxian discourse, as Deleuze and Guattari do in the opening pages of Anti-Oedipus. They say if we want to have some idea of the forces exerted by the body without organs, then we must first establish a parallel between desiring production and social production. To put it another way, we have to establish that desire functions on the same level as the real. However, Deleuze and Guattari then go on to say this parallel is to be treated as strictly heuristic, at least in the first instance. And I quote, "Its one purpose is to point out the fact that the forms of social production, like those of desiring production, involve an unengendered, non-productive attitude, an element of anti-production coupled within the process. A full body that functions as a socius. This socius may be the body of the earth, that of the tyrant or capital. This is the body that Marx is referring to when he says that it is not the product of labour, but rather appears as its natural or divine presupposition. This is the body without organs in its social aspect. It falls back on all production," I'm quoting here, "constituting a surface over which the forces and agents of production are distributed, thereby appointing for itself all surplus production and arrogating to itself both the whole and the parts of the process which now seem to emanate from it as a quasi-cause." What I'm emphasising here in these quotes is the fact that the body without organs functions primarily as a notion of presupposition. And this is the point that I want to elaborate. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari transformed this insight into an analytic principle. And I think it's perhaps the most critical thing we can think about with respect to the body without organs. They say it has two phases. An initial phase of construction, and then a subsequent phase of making things happen. So the body without organs works in two ways. It does two things. It comes into being. Once it comes into being, everything functions on top of it as though it was there all along. To give you an example, Judith Butler has demonstrated that the concept of gender, not the actual experience of gender, follows exactly the same course. What she effectively claims, without obviously using Deleuzian terminology, is that gender is an incorporeal transformation. The labels man or woman seize us and transform us. Gender is an attribute and an effect that penetrates our bodies and functions there as a quasi-cause for everything that we do. We are not born into our gender, we assume it, but once it has taken hold, we act in its name. This effect interacts with other effects such as race and class. Now, as Butler points out, even if one accepted that it was possible to choose one's gender, it is nevertheless impossible to choose not to have any gender at all. You thus desire on gender, it is part of your body without organs. Now, gender in this sense is a rigged game. You can choose to be a man or a woman or transgendered, but you cannot choose to be non-gendered because the very notion of sex as some natural or neutral biological, i.e. non-cultural given, is simply the other half of the equation. So gender and sex, then, the two concepts, work together in a manner Deleuze and Guattari describe as bi-univocal. Each effect functions as the concrete proof of existence of the other, and this is what it means to say that they are quasi-causes. We oscillate between the two, jumping from one circle of hell to the other. Gender, they argue, is the mechanism power needs to exert itself. Now, part of the difficulty Butler has in explaining how gender and sex differ from one another and yet operate together stems from the fact that these terms have the appearance of being, as it were, unengendered or naturally occurring. But, as she effectively argues, but I would suggest doesn't have the vocabulary to do, these terms are very far from naturally occurring. They are engendered, but in such a way that they seem to fall back on themselves and smother their origins from view so as to appear unengendered. And this is how the body without organs works. So the point I'm trying to make is the body without organs works in this particular way of creating something, of gendering something, bringing something into being, but doing so in such a way that it makes the origins of that object, that entity, invisible to us. So we assume it takes the form of a presupposition. So the chief operation of the body without organs then is to fall back on itself, to fall back on the process of creation and smother the origins from view and thus create a plane of desire, a plane of immanence. Now this example points to what is perhaps the key feature of the body without organs. It functions as pure presupposition, that is, the thought or idea which thought cannot grasp. It is like our soul, always there, always in need of work, but always unreachable. So from an analytic point of view, the question is then, how do we reach the body without organs? How do we make it available to ourselves for analysis? Now I want to suggest that one of the ways we can do this, one of the ways in which presuppositions can be brought to light, is by asking a very old ethical question, namely, what ought to be? In the first years of the internet, i.e. in the early 1990s, when it was still small enough to be contained on a single mainframe computer, which is really just unimaginable, but if you go back when I was writing my PhD, the whole of the internet could be kept on what I have now at home as my laptop. It's an unimaginable point of origin. The key permutation of this question, what ought to be, was whether or not the internet would be like TV, just another distraction, or would it really allow for some kind of connectedness that it seemed to make possible? The American critic Bill McKibben thinks that the answer is still not clear, and as he puts it, more people use the web to look at unclothed young women and lose money on poker than for any other reason. And setting aside the moralising tone here, the contrast with TV is instructive, because in its early days it was subjected to considerable scrutiny and regulation by the government, I mean TV here. The kind of scrutiny and regulation it was subjected to varied quite widely from nation to nation. The Australian government, for instance, regarded it as a service, and placed it on the same policy category as health and education. So the regulation of television in Australia was regulated as a service like health or education. Interestingly, at that time, TV was thought too important and also too dangerous. The government grasped immediately the propaganda power of television. Remember, TV is coming into being shortly after the Second World War. People have memories of Nazism and its mobilisation of the media. So it was thought too dangerous to leave in private hands, and policy was developed accordingly. The basic tenets of its policy were that it should be free, that it should be available to all. The infrastructural cost of this is staggering when you consider the dispersed nature of the population of Australia. I mean, bear in mind, Australia is the size of the country is from here to nearly Moscow. It's an enormous country with very, very few people. So to have free TV in the middle of the outback was enormously expensive, but nonetheless that was the policy. They also said that TV should be informative. All stations were required to provide news services as well as educational programming for children. So the government then did not opt for a complete state control as Britain did, but neither did it leave it all to the market as the US did, although even there the government placed severe restrictions on content. So the Americans had a much more laissez-faire approach, but nonetheless they regulated content very strictly, and perhaps even more strictly than Australia. Now Australia aimed for a kind of middle ground that allowed for commercial applications, but kept a close eye on what those applications were. TV was essentially a national technology, and the issue of what it could and should be was a matter of national debate, and that is still the case today. Now, the internet, interestingly, has never been a national technology in this sense, so its development has not been overseen by a government body, except in the most ad hoc way via band-aid legislation, which in the case of child pornography, say, can do nothing more than to ban certain practices and create the judiciary conditions needed to punish the offenders, but it cannot actually stop it. And that is how things should be, according to the majority of internet pundits. Whether e-business billionaires or left-wing academics, internet equals freedom. Now, this is the internet's body without organs, the great and unquestioned presupposition that it is an agent of freedom. The material problem confronting schizoanalysis, then, is knowing whether the body without organs we have are any good or not, or more to the point, knowing whether we have the means of determining whether they are any good or not. The body that organs then is an evaluative concept which, as Guattari instructs us in his last book, Chaosmosis, should be used dialectically, which is to say with a view towards an understanding of how it is produced. In other words, we should ask two basic questions. How is a particular body of that organs produced, and what circulates on it once it has been produced? Now, just how enfeebled a concept of freedom the internet rhetoric implies was exposed, I think, by the press reaction to the story of Google's entry into the Chinese market, which is said to be growing by something like 20 million users a year and was already worth an estimated 151 million per annum in 2004, a figure which, by the way, is literally tiny by US standards, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out the potential for growth. To be allowed to set up servers on mainland China and create a Google CN service, which will be faster and better suited to the purpose than the regular US version Chinese people already have access to, Google had to agree to adhere to the Chinese government's regulation and control of internet content. And this means complying with what is famously known as the 3T rule. You're not allowed to mention Tibet, Taiwan, or Tiananmen. These 3 Ts are all off limits, as are such search categories as human rights, Amnesty International, pornography, and of course Falun Gong. It is believed that there are something like 30,000 online police monitoring chat rooms, blogs and news portals to ensure that these topics aren't discussed and these kinds of sites aren't accessed. Although this isn't the first time Google has agreed to cooperate with government and effectively censor its search results. For instance, in Germany it restricts references to sites that deny the Holocaust, while in France it restricts access to sites that incite racial violence. The scale of its compliance with the Chinese government censorship requirements far exceeds anything it has done before. Now, of course, these questions about Google were provoked in part because of Google's corporate ethic, if you like, of do no evil. So the question is whether or not this kind of censorship constitutes a kind of evil. That Google chose to make these compromises as a necessary price of doing business in the world's fastest growing economy was read by many as a betrayal of the values of freedom that Google is supposedly an emblem of. The fact that these jeremiads were largely confined to the business pages of liberal papers suggests that the notion of freedom they had in mind was largely of the freedom to do business kind, wrapped up in the rhetoric of the freedom of speech. Now, this obviously self-serving acquiescence to censorship is defended by the company on the grounds that, and I quote, providing no information or heavily degraded user experience that amounts to no information is more inconsistent. End of quote. Now, what this case demonstrated is that Google isn't really concerned about our access to content at all. All the blustery talk about compromised values was really just a verbal smokescreen trying to cover up this one glaring truth. Google's priority is its access to new markets, and it will not hesitate to compromise its putative ethic of do no evil in order to achieve that goal. If we regard Google as a gigantic multinational corporation, which with a net worth in excess of US 80 billion, making it bigger than either Coke, General Motors or McDonald's, it is in fact, then there should be little or no surprise in its about-face in China. It is only if we continue to buy into the fantasy that it is somehow the internet as a whole is a bastion of freedom that we find these events dismaying. If the internet were ever a commons, to use the word anti-corporate commentators like Naomi Klein have made fashionable, then there can be no doubt that it is rapidly being enclosed. The implication being that Amazon, Google and eBay are still only the primitive accumulation stage of capitalism. Information is in effect a natural resource like oil that Google exploits without regard to the environment, as oil companies do when we aren't watching, and sometimes even when we are watching. Now, nowhere is this more evident than in the Google-led hype surrounding the convergence of internet and mobile phone technologies. In an op-ed piece for the Financial Times, Google CEO Eric Schmidt went on record saying that internet-enabled mobile phones would effectively solve the problem of how to gain access to emerging markets in undeveloped countries where the absence of landline infrastructure would otherwise have proved an impassable obstacle. Now, he doesn't put it like that, of course. He's never so indelicate as to mention the dirty word market. His rhetoric is liberatory and egalitarian. The internet has democratised information, Schmidt says, or at least it has for those who have access to it, and that, he says, is the problem. Not everyone has access. In sub-Saharan Africa, Schmidt laments, less than 1% of households have a landline. Now, if that statistic wasn't bad enough for business, that presupposes the existence of such basic utilities as a functioning telephonic network, then there is the even worse news that if broadband was available to every household, that still wouldn't change things very much, because very few people in this region could actually afford a computer in any case. So mobile phones then will liberate this technologically dark part of the world by overcoming these twin obstacles to online access. On the blessed day when everyone has internet-enabled mobile phones, and I'm quoting now from Schmidt, he says, "A school child in Africa will be able to find research papers from around the world or to see ancient manuscripts from a library in Oxford. Until then, however, the digital divide prevents this democratising magic from having its effect." According to Schmidt, thanks to the internet, we don't have to take what business, the media or politicians say, and I quote again, at face value, and this, he says, is empowering. Now, Schmidt's view is that what is actually said online isn't as important as the freedom to say whatever one happens to want to say. Thus, he says, governments should stop focusing on how to control the web, and I quote again, concentrate on how to give internet access to more people in more countries. I.e., in other words, governments should help Google expand its market by providing the infrastructure to do so. By the same token, as Google's negative response to requests for assistance in tracking down users of child pornography from US law enforcement agencies illustrates, Google thinks the government shouldn't be allowed to impinge on its market either. Although Yahoo, MSN and AOL have been willing to help out, Google has held fast, citing the right to privacy as its rationale. But Google patently speaks with a forked tongue on the subject. Co-founder of Google, Larry Page, defended the company's refusal to help identify child pornographers by saying, rather tellingly, I think, that the company relies on the trust of its users and that giving out data on users would break that trust. His implication is obvious. If Google gave out data on its users, it would effectively turn customers away and eventually lose its preeminent place as market leader. Protecting market share is how we should understand Page's call for legislation to stop government from being able to ask for data in the first place. But this doesn't mean that Google actually respects the privacy of its users, if by that one means it doesn't keep them under surveillance. It is constantly gathering data on users individually and collectively, and even publicises this fact under the innocuous-sounding rubric of Google Trends by releasing maps of most frequently searched topics broken down by region. Eschewing any pretense to scientificity, these maps make for titillating readers as one ponders what it means in cultural geographical terms that the most frequent Google searches in the city of St Albans in Hertfordshire were for gyms, weight loss and the Atkins diet. Does this make it the most self-absorbed city in Britain, as claimed by the Sunday Times, in a half-page piece studded with such tidbits of spurious psychosocial information gleaned from Google Trends? Now, obviously, more of a lifestyle than a hard news piece, although it was in the news section, what is particularly striking about this article is its complete lack of sensitivity to the fact that such maps are the product of electronic surveillance, i.e. precisely the kind of thing the Sunday Times would normally rail against. That a liberal paper like this doesn't see Google Trends as surveillance is evidence of just how little critical attention is paid to the dimension of the internet in the public sphere. But I don't want to give the impression that this is some kind of conspiracy, because the fact is Google is very open about its snooping. One Google executive, Marissa Mayer, has even said in the press that we should expect it. So this brings me to the next section when I want to sort of ask the question whether or not the internet in these terms can be thought of as a rhizome. Now I ask this question because almost since its inception the internet has been thought of as a rhizome, and it has in many ways the connection between the idea of the rhizome and the internet has been one of the reasons why Deleuze's work has become so widely read within media technology studies. There seems to be a perfect fit between this concept and the internet. So obviously with that preface, what I want to suggest is that I don't think that fit is as good as it might appear. So is the internet a rhizome? All the straws in the wind seem to say yes it is. And I quote here, this is from Mark Poster. Whereas mechanical machines are inserted into hierarchically organised social systems obeying and enhancing this type of structure, the internet is ruled by no one and is open to expansion or addition at anyone's whim as long as its communication protocols are followed. This contrast was anticipated theoretically by Deleuze and Guattari, especially in 1,000 Plateaus, in which they distinguish between arboreal and rhizomic cultural forms. The former is stable, centred, hierarchical. The latter is nomadic, multiple, dissented, a fitting description of the difference between a hydroelectric plant and the internet. A strange point of comparison, really, to compare a hydroelectric plant and the internet, it doesn't strike me as being necessarily the best way in which one might approximate what kind of a new technology it is. Now, there are, of course, some excellent grounds for thinking that the internet meets some, if not all, of the basic criteria of the rhizome, which Deleuze and Guattari list as follows. There are 6 basic criteria for the rhizome, 6 things it should do, and I'll just briefly list those for you. The rhizome connects any point to any other point. Connections do not have to be between the same and the same, or like and like. The rhizome cannot be reduced to either the one or the multiple because it is composed of dimensions, directions in motion, not units. Consequently, no point in the rhizome can be altered without altering the whole. The rhizome operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, and offshoots, and not reproduction. The rhizome pertains to an infinitely modifiable map with multiple entrances and exits that must be produced. The rhizome is acentered, non-signifying, and acephalous. The rhizome isn't amenable to any structural or generative model. So how well does the internet map against these 6 principles? At the bare machine level, it seems to agree with the first principle very closely. The ideal of the internet is that any computer can be connected to any other computer. Now, how well this works in practice is another matter altogether, as anyone who has ever experienced the frustration of trying to access big sites using low bandwidth connections such as dial-up, or has had to rely on servers clogged by high volumes of traffic, can readily attest. But the more interesting philosophical question here, which applies as much to Deleuze and Guattari as the internet, is the premium we place on intention. Until the advent of search engines of the capability of Google, the phrase surfing the internet, sorry, I've missed a sentence here. It was extremely difficult to implement one intent in relation to the internet. So the first question I'm raising then is intention. What does it mean to intend to find something on the internet? The phrase surfing the internet, which I don't think anybody uses anymore, but when the internet first came into being in the early 1990s, it was a fairly common way of talking about using the internet, to surf it. It reflects the difficulty of exercising one's intent in relation to the internet. Using the internet used to be, and in some cases still is, like looking for a needle in a haystack. And basically what one did in order to find something was to surf from one site to another in a fairly haphazard fashion. Hence the proliferation in the early 1990s of books listing useful websites, which themselves tended to be indexes or directories, enabling you to find other sites. By the same token, little attention was given to domain names at this time, with the result that many of them look like calculus equations rather than user-friendly mnemonics, which we're accustomed to now. So you move from one web address to another as though from one fixed point in space to another, which interestingly is not at all what surfers do. So the description of surfing doesn't really match what you do on the internet anyway. You move from fixed point to fixed point to fixed point. This brings us to the second principle. Here the match is a little less straightforward. For a start, the practical reality of the internet is nothing at all like the multidimensional sensorium envisaged by William Gibson when he first used the term cyberspace in his novel Neuromancer. But then again, at the time, he famously didn't own a computer. However, Gibson's vision of cyberspace has had lasting influence, and many people do think of the internet as a realisation of the Deleuzian ideal of multiplicity. But the incredible proliferation and constantly expanding number of websites does not by itself mean that the internet can be classed as a multiplicity in Deleuze's sense. Are websites dimensions or units of the web? Now, there is a simple way to answer this question. What happens when we add or subtract a site? The answer is that it isn't clear that the addition or the subtraction of any one site actually affects the whole. If several million sites were to vanish, then that would clearly make a difference. But the loss of a few hundred or even a few thousand might not. If sites were dimensions, then according to Deleuze and Guattari's definition of the rhizome, their removal would alter the whole. So we have to conclude that individual websites are units of the internet, not its dimensions. Empirically, we know that the number of websites is important. There is, for example, a vast difference between the internet of today, which has hundreds of millions of specific sites and trillions of pages, and the internet of 1990, which had fewer than 200 sites and could be contained in a single home PC. But this doesn't mean we have to abandon the idea that the internet is a multiplicity, because there is another way we can come at this problem. Thus we come to the third principle, that the rhizome operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, and offshoots, and not reproduction, which is essentially a matter of population. which in contrast to the numbering number can be grasped in dimensional terms. Now, Darwin's two great insights were, according to Deleuze and Guattari, that the population is more significant than the type in determining the genetic properties of a species, and that change occurs not through an increase in complexity, such as the proliferation of individual websites or multiplication of web link would entail, but rather the opposite, through simplification. Internet usage certainly bears this point out, and as recent trends confirm, the internet is the standard source of product information. Everything from details of the latest designs to replacement user manuals are lodged there. It is also becoming the preferred point of sale as more and more business is conducted online. I think in Britain now, household shopping for just ordinary grocery items is passing 25% of all shopping is done online. It is also becoming, it is steadily taking over from its rivals as TV and radio in the role of content provision, as podcasts and downloads become more the rule than the exception. In the process, the internet is changing how we understand the media. On the one hand, it is steadily displacing the variety of media that used to exist, so newspapers, magazines, TV, radio, cinema and so on, onto itself, while on the other hand it is absorbing new interactive functions such as data searches, direct online sales that the other media can't offer quite so easily. Paradoxically then, from the perspective of the user, the internet is without doubt the most powerful homogenising and standardising machine invented since money. First of all pre-existing media have been compelled to adapt themselves to suit the internet environment. Second, having stripped the media of its exclusive preserve to make and distribute news, movies or whatever, the internet has enabled a whole new kind of media production, from the so-called citizen journalists we hear so much about today, to bloggers, to home movie makers, amateur pornographers and so on. Viewed from the perspective of the media as a whole, i.e. from a population perspective, the internet has simplified what media means and in the process set off a massive expansion of media operations into virtually every corner of existence, and it is having the same effect on retail. The fourth principle, that the rhizome pertains to an infinitely modifiable map with multiple entrances and exits that must be produced, is, I would hazard, the most important. But its implications are neither obvious nor fully explained by Deleuze and Guattari, although it is clear that it has the highest priority in their view. In effect, what it means is this: the rhizome is not manifest in things, but rather it is a latent potential that has to be realised by experimentation. And this can be linked to the sixth principle, namely that the rhizome isn't amenable to any structural or generative model, because basically what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is that you can't either prescribe the internet into existence or expect it to find it naturally occurring. It has to be invented. The rhizome is the subterranean pathway connecting all our actions, invisibly determining our decision to do this rather than that. Aware of its existence, and indeed its operation, we do not have full control over our lives. The rhizome is, in this sense, a therapeutic tool. For both statements and desires, here I'm quoting again, the issue is never to reduce the unconscious or to interpret it or to make it signify according to a tree model. The issue is to produce the unconscious, and with it new statements, different desires. The rhizome is precisely this production of the unconscious. The rhizome of the internet cannot simply be the pre-existing network of connected computers. Rather, we have to conceive it in terms of the set of choices that have been made concerning its use and determine the degree to which the resulting grid is open or closed. And thus I come to the fifth principle, that the rhizome is a-centred, non-signifying and acephalous, and this appears to be the one that could be left unchallenged. Yet if we were to grant that the internet is a-centred, non-signifying and acephalous in appearance, and indeed in its very construction, the reality of its day-to-day use still does not live up to this much-vaunted Deleuzian ideal. Here we have to remind ourselves that Deleuze and Guattari regard the rhizome as a tendency rather than a state of being. It must constantly compete with an equally strong tendency in the opposite direction, namely towards what they term the arboreal. The internet exhibits arboreal tendencies as well as rhizomatic tendencies, and any balanced assessment of it would have to take these into account and weigh up the relative strengths. To begin with, one still moves from point to point through the internet. There is no liberated line of flight in cyberspace as yet. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, Google searches are very far from being disinterested, as John Battle's book The Search makes clear. Now that retailers can pay Google to link certain items, what Google calls AdWords, to their business name, so that a search for a book, for instance, will always lead to Amazon or to A Books or to whatever. The minimal conceptual distinction that used to separate Google from the Yellow Pages has basically vanished. The operating premise of Google searches may not be that whenever we are searching, no matter what we are searching for, we are actually looking for something to buy, but its results certainly appear to follow that code. Insofar as we rely on Google as our user's guide to the internet we actually see and use is thus stable, centred and hierarchical, i.e. the very opposite of rhizomatic. Google searches are conducted on a stable electronic snapshot of the internet, not the living thing itself. I don't know if you know this, but what Google does is every day it basically makes a copy of the entire internet, and all the searches that are conducted on Google searches are conducted on yesterday's internet, not today. So it's never conducted on the live internet, as it were. It's always on a snapshot from yesterday. And thus it introduces a ranking system. Google searches are conducted on this stable electronic snapshot, which it indexes very precisely. The search engine is patently a centering system, de facto and de jure. In other words, what could be more hierarchical than the notion of page rank? This is not to say that Google isn't an extremely useful tool, because plainly it is, but it is to insist not only that it has its limitations, some of which are quite serious, but that it isn't the only means of searching for information available. I guess, put very simply, what I'm saying is that the Google search is not a disinterested search. You don't simply have access to whatever you want to find. You don't mobilise your intention through a Google search. Google search is dictated by advertising concerns, and therefore it takes you to things very directly. In other words, it's not a disinterested search. It's not simply a walk in the forest. Now, if we were to follow Deleuze's watchword that philosophy has the concepts it deserves according to how well it formulates its problems, then we would not start from the idea that the internet might be a body without organs or looks like a rhizome or indeed any other pre-existing point of view. Instead, we should try to see how the internet works and develop our concepts from there. In its first flush, the internet seemed to be about connectedness, but that idea has since been exposed as a perhaps necessary but nonetheless impossible ideal, perhaps like the Lacanian concept of sexual relations, that we're at once compelled to try to realise and destined never to succeed. Now, though, it is becoming clear that the internet is much more about searching than connecting. Although connecting people is a major feature of the internet's cultural role, it is predominantly used to search for objects, commodities, and in the case of pornography and celebrity gossip, one may well say it is searching for people in their guise as commodities. I just want to quickly jump to the end here and finish on this note. One can find objective evidence of the intensifying influence of what I would call search engine culture in the constant consumer demand for increased bandwidth and memory capacity to facilitate it. Most households in the West possess vastly more computing power than they could ever hope to use, except for such activities as searching the web. It may be that online business is only just now starting to take off and show genuine profits because it's only lately developed an appreciation of the architecture of the desire called searching. As John Lanchester puts it, Google has a direct line, and I'm quoting here, if not quite to the unconscious dreaming mind of the world, at least to the part of it which voices its wishes. I believe the same is true of Amazon and eBay, and indeed a range of other internet services such as online dating and grocery shopping that are yet to produce corporations of the gigantic proportions of these icons. But I don't accept that Google is the global id, which is John Lanchester's idea, because to do so is to accept that our deepest atavistic desire is to buy something, and there could be no more dystopian outlook than that. Neither is it the global body without organs, though with a bit of work it could be, and who knows what changes that might bring. Thank you.